The smile is a professional tool. I want to be clear about that before anything else, because what comes later makes more sense if you understand this first. I learned it in my second year of arbitration work, from a mediator named Astra who had 40 years of experience and 3 ex-spouses who all cited unpredictable emotional responses in their separation filings. She told me, when the room gets dangerous, smile. Not because you're happy. Because it's the one thing nobody knows how to respond to. Anger meets anger. Fear meets aggression. Confidence meets challenge. But a calm smile in a bad situation, that just sits there in the middle of the room and makes everyone uncomfortable, and nobody can explain why. I've been doing it for 11 years. At some point it stopped being a choice and became a reflex. My nervous system now apparently interprets high-stakes confrontation as time to look mildly pleased about something. This is relevant because of what happened when they walked me into the throne room. The Villain auction house had described the contract honestly: 6 months, personal service, astronomical compensation, ancient legal framework that made it binding under 3 different jurisdictions. I'd read the documents twice and had my own arbitration contacts verify the exit clauses. Everything checked out. The buyer was listed only as a senior member of House Zira, which I should have found more specific but didn't because the money was genuinely extraordinary and I had a lease renewal coming up. I found out who she was when the doors opened. I smiled. The throne room was exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that had been powerful for long enough to stop trying to prove it. No excess, no spectacle, just scale and quality, the specific aesthetic of people who have been making things correctly for so long that correct has become invisible. The ceiling was high enough that sound disappeared into it. The floor was a single piece of something that wasn't stone but behaved like it. The throne itself was functional, which somehow made it more intimidating than an ornate one would have been. She was already seated when I came in. This was intentional. I understood that immediately. The staging was deliberate, she at elevation, me at floor level, the full length of the room between us, her court arranged along the sides. Classic dominance architecture. I've sat in enough difficult rooms to recognize when a room has been designed to make you feel small. I noted all of this and smiled anyway, because that's what I do, and walked the length of the room at my own pace, which was not the fast pace of someone who has been told to approach and is obeying. She let me get 3/4 of the way there before she started speaking. The speech was good. I'll give her that. It was well constructed, the pacing was deliberate, the specific details she'd chosen to include were selected to maximize the psychological impact of my situation. She covered the legal framework, the duration, the scope of service, the public nature of the arrangement. She used the word property twice, which was technically accurate under the contract, and also clearly chosen for effect rather than precision. I stood and listened and smiled. She stopped mid-sentence. "Why are you smiling?" she said. It wasn't a question in the curious sense. It was the tone of someone who has encountered something outside their expected parameters and is requesting an explanation so they can file it correctly. "You remind me of someone," I said. The court was very quiet. "Explain," she said. "A client," I said. 3 years ago. Merchant house on Kara Station. They'd bought out a competitor's debt and structured the acquisition so that the competitor's senior staff were technically their employees for 18 months. Similar legal framework to this, actually. They brought me in to manage the transition. I paused. The head of the merchant house gave a very similar speech to the one you just gave. Same structure. Same emphasis on the word property. And, she said. And 18 months later the competitor's staff had restructured the merchant house's entire operation, identified 3 significant inefficiencies in their supply chain, and the head of the merchant house was asking the competitor's former CEO to stay on permanently. I looked at her. I'm not saying that's what's happening here. I'm just noting the similarity. The silence was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people are waiting to see what the most powerful person in it will do next. "You will clean my private quarters," she said. Starting tomorrow. I nodded. Of course. That's all, she said. The dismissal was clean and final and designed to land as a humiliation. Thank you, I said. She looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes that I catalogued as recalibrating but didn't have enough information to interpret further. I was shown to my quarters, which were spare and functional and clearly chosen to communicate something about my status. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the lease renewal I'd been planning to handle with the contract money, and whether the timeline still worked, and concluded that it did if I was careful about the first 2 months. Then I thought about the throne room. The speech had been good. The staging had been better. She understood power architecture intuitively, the room, the timing, the word choices. That kind of understanding usually comes from spending a long time in rooms where the architecture was aimed at you before you learned to aim it at others. I filed that observation and went to sleep. The cleaning assignment started the next morning. Her private quarters were 3 connected rooms, a working space, a rest space, and something in between that seemed to function as both depending on the hour. I was given cleaning equipment and a time window and left to it. The quarters were interesting. Not in the way a display is interesting, in the way a workspace is interesting, where the accumulation of objects tells you about the work. There were documents I couldn't read, maps of systems I recognized, communication equipment that was significantly more sophisticated than the standard diplomatic-grade hardware. And there were artifacts. One of them stopped me. It was in a case on the far wall, not displayed prominently. Placed the way you place something you look at regularly rather than something you want others to notice. A document, preserved behind something transparent. Old. The script was early Villain, pre-dynastic, and I knew enough to recognize it without being able to read it fluently. The format I knew very well. It was an arbitration record. Specific type, specific era, the kind used when 2 founding houses were establishing the terms of a coalition. I was still looking at it when she came in. I hadn't heard her. I'd been paying attention to the document. I registered her presence when she stopped moving, which she did abruptly, the way people stop when they find someone doing something unexpected. The cleaning is done, I said without turning around. I was looking at the arbitration record. I apologize if that's not permitted. A pause. You can read it. The format, I said. Not the script. I know the document type. I turned around. Pre-dynastic coalition arbitration. Before the houses used standardized legal frameworks. Each one was negotiated individually. She looked at me with the expression I was starting to recognize as her default when I said something outside her predicted range. My ancestors, she said. From the founding coalition. The proportional equity clause in the lower section. I said. Is that original or amended? Another pause. Longer. Original, she said. Most people assume it was amended because the current standard framework doesn't include it. The current standard framework dropped it about 200 years ago, I said. The original version was actually more stable. The amendment was politically convenient at the time, but it introduced a structural weakness that showed up about 60 years later in. I stopped. I'm sorry. You probably know this. Continue, she said. I continued. She listened. At some point I noticed that neither of us was performing anything. She wasn't performing authority, and I wasn't performing compliance. We were just 2 people looking at a document and talking about what it meant. About 5 minutes and she seemed to notice the same thing, because she stopped the conversation with a precision that felt deliberate and left without explanation. I finished the cleaning I'd already finished and left. In the corridor I thought about the document, and about the specific quality of her attention when I was talking about it, not evaluating, not strategic. Just present. I thought, that's interesting. Then I thought, this is going to be a complicated 6 months. The cleaning schedule was daily. 2 hours in the morning, 1 hour in the evening, the specific rooms designated in the contract appendix. I did it correctly and completely and without complaint, which I suspect was more irritating to the people watching than resistance would have been. There were always people watching. Not obviously. Villain court culture apparently considers obvious surveillance beneath dignity. But I'd been in enough high-stakes environments to recognize the difference between a room that's empty and a room that's empty and occupied. The second type has a specific quality of stillness. I noted the watchers and didn't acknowledge them, which seemed to be the correct response because nothing escalated. The court itself was navigable once I understood the architecture of it. Every court has one, not the physical architecture, the social kind. Who reports to whom, who has access to what, where the actual decisions get made as opposed to where they get announced. I'd been mapping it since the first day, the way I map any environment I'm going to be working in for an extended period. It was interesting work. Villain court structure was more lateral than I'd expected, less hierarchy, more network, which made it more resilient but also more susceptible to specific kinds of pressure. I thought about this while cleaning. It gave me something to do with the part of my brain that doesn't turn off. The arbitration case happened on day 31. I was in the working room, her working room, the connected space, and I could hear the session through the wall because the acoustic insulation in that section of the palace was poor, which I'd noticed on day 3 but which wasn't my problem to flag unless asked. 2 houses, an inheritance dispute, competing claims on a property that had been in continuous litigation for 60 years. The kind of case that stays in litigation because resolving it would require one side to admit they were wrong, and neither side was built for that. Her arbiters had been working on it for 2 weeks. I could hear why it wasn't moving. They were applying current standard framework to a pre-framework dispute, which is like trying to use a modern map to navigate a city that was built before the map's coordinate system existed. The underlying documents predated standardization. You couldn't read them with standardized tools. I kept cleaning. The dispute continued through the wall. I finished the cleaning I was there to do and was packing up my equipment when I heard one of her arbiters use a specific legal term incorrectly, not slightly incorrectly, fundamentally incorrectly, in a way that had probably been quietly derailing the whole proceeding for 2 weeks without anyone noticing because everyone in the room had learned from the same standardized texts. I stood there for a moment with my cleaning equipment in my hands. Then I opened the door and walked in. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens and everyone is waiting to see if it's a crisis or just unusual. The term you're using, I said to the room generally, has 2 meanings in pre-standardization villain legal framework. The standardized version collapsed them into one. In the context of this document, I looked at the primary exhibit on the table. It means the secondary definition, not the primary. Which means the property claim you're disputing isn't actually a property claim. It's a usage rights claim. Which is a completely different legal category with a completely different resolution framework. Silence. Who are you? One of the arbiters said. Nobody relevant. I said. But I'm right. I left. Went back to my quarters. Sat down and thought about what I'd just done, which had not been in any version of my plan for the day, and which I genuinely could not explain in terms that satisfied me. The case wasn't mine. The outcome didn't affect me. I had every professional reason to stay out of it, and no professional reason to walk into it. I thought, that was strange. I thought, I hope it wasn't a mistake. She came to my quarters 2 hours later. No announcement, no guard, just a knock that I recognized as hers because I'd been in this environment long enough to recognize the specific patterns of how different people move through it. Come in, I said. She came in. Looked at the room, which was spare and functional, then at me. The arbitration, she said. Yes, I said. You were cleaning the adjacent room. Yes. You heard through the wall. The acoustic insulation in that section is poor, I said. I noticed it on day 3. You didn't mention it. It wasn't my problem to mention unless asked, I said. She looked at me with the expression I was starting to be able to read, not the public version she used in the throne room, the private one. More direct. Less constructed. Why did you intervene? she said. Bad arbitration irritates me, I said, professionally. I can't turn it off. You could have said nothing. Yes, I said. Your contract doesn't require you to contribute to court proceedings. No, I said. It doesn't. We were talking about contract scope and professional obligations. We were also talking about something else that neither of us was naming yet. The case resolved, she said, within 2 hours of your intervention. The usage rights framework is much simpler than the property framework, I said. Once you're in the right category, the path is straightforward. 60 years of litigation, she said. 2 hours. Wrong tools, I said. Not a hard problem. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you want something in return? I looked at her. No. Most people who do something useful want something in return. I told you, I said. Bad arbitration irritates me. It's not a transaction. She held my gaze for a moment. The specific quality of her attention in this room was different from the throne room. There was no performance in it, no management. She was just looking at me the way you look at something you're trying to understand. The artifact, she said. The pre-dynastic record. You said the proportional equity clause was more stable than the amended version. Structurally, yes, I said. The amendment created a single point of failure that. I know what it created, she said. I've been arguing for reinstating the original clause for 4 years. The council considers it unnecessary. I thought about that. They're using the same standardized framework everyone uses, I said. Which doesn't show the structural weakness because the weakness only appears under specific pressure conditions that the standardized models don't test for. Yes, she said. Do you have the documentation for the argument? I said. The one you've been making to the council? A pause. Why? Because if the argument isn't working, there's probably a presentation problem, I said. The underlying case is correct. If the council isn't accepting it, they're either not understanding it or not finding it relevant to their immediate interests. She looked at me for a long moment. You're offering to help me, she said. I'm offering a professional observation, I said. What you do with it is up to you. She left without saying whether she would take the observation or not. I sat in my spare functional quarters and thought about the specific quality of the silence she'd left behind, which was different from the silence after the throne room. Less strategic. More like someone who had been handed something they weren't sure how to carry yet. I thought, I should probably stop noticing things like that. I thought, that's not going to happen. She sent for the documentation 3 days later. Not directly, it came through the court's administrative system, a formal request for my assessment of the council presentation materials, routed through the contract's ancillary services clause, which apparently covered professional consultation when the contracted individual had relevant expertise. Someone had read the contract carefully enough to find that clause. I doubted it was her personally, but I also doubted she hadn't known about it. The documentation was extensive. 4 years of arguments, counter-arguments, supporting evidence, counsel responses. I read it over 2 evenings, which meant I was reading in my spare quarters by low light after the cleaning shifts were done, which was fine. I do my best analytical work when there's nothing else competing for my attention. The underlying case was exactly as strong as I'd thought. The structural weakness in the amended clause was documented clearly. The historical precedents were well chosen, the logic was airtight. The presentation was the problem. She'd been making the argument the way a lawyer makes an argument, building from foundation to conclusion, establishing each premise before moving to the next, treating the counsel as an audience that would follow the reasoning if it was laid out correctly. That works when your audience wants to understand. It doesn't work when your audience's primary concern is that accepting your argument requires them to admit the current framework is wrong, which requires admitting that everyone who approved the current framework was wrong, which includes most of them. The problem wasn't the argument. The problem was that the argument was asking the counsel to be rational when what they needed was to feel like they'd made a good decision. I wrote up my assessment. It was direct and specific and probably more candid than was strictly diplomatic, but she'd asked for a professional observation, and vague professional observations are useless. She responded the next morning with a single line through the administrative system: * come to the working room this evening. 7th hour. *. I went. She was already there when I arrived, the council documentation spread across the working table. No guard in the room. I'd noticed that the private working sessions never had guards inside the room, only in the corridor. I'd stopped noting it as unusual around day 20. Your assessment, she said without preamble. Yes, I said. You said the council needs to feel they've made a good decision rather than understand they've been making a wrong one. That's a simplification, I said, but essentially yes. How do you restructure an argument to accomplish that? I pulled a chair to the table without being invited to sit, which I'd learned she didn't object to in the working room context. You stop arguing that the amendment was wrong, I said. You start arguing that the original clause was forward-thinking and that current circumstances have finally caught up to what your ancestor understood 400 years ago. The council isn't admitting error. They're recognizing wisdom. She looked at the documents. Same conclusion. Different framing. Same destination, I said. Different road. The road matters when your travelers are the ones choosing whether to walk. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you do this professionally. Reframe arguments. Arbitration is mostly reframing, I said. People rarely have incompatible interests. They usually have compatible interests and incompatible positions. The work is finding the framing where both sides can reach the same place without either of them having to walk backward. That sounds like manipulation, she said. It sounds like it, I said. It's not. Manipulation changes what people want. This just changes how they see what they already want. She looked at me with the private expression, the one without management in it. Show me, she said. We worked for 2 hours. I took her existing documentation and restructured the presentation argument, section by section, showing her specifically what I was changing and why. She asked good questions, not the questions of someone learning a skill from scratch, but the questions of someone who already understands the underlying logic and is learning a specific application of it. She pushed back twice on restructured sections, and both times she was right and I revised. At some point the working session stopped feeling like a consultation and started feeling like collaboration, and I noticed the shift but didn't say anything about it because naming it seemed like it would change something I didn't want changed yet. The council session is in 12 days, she said. Enough time, I said. If you practice the new framing until it's natural. The argument needs to sound like something you believe, not something you've been coached on. I do believe it, she said. I know, I said. But you believe it the old way. You need to believe it the new way. She looked at me. There's a difference. The old way is, the amendment was wrong and here's the proof. The new way is, my ancestors saw something 400 years ago that we're only now in a position to fully appreciate. The first one asks the council to be wrong. The second one invites them to be wise. They're not wise, she said. No, I said. But they want to be seen as wise. That's enough to work with. Something moved across her face, not the smile, nothing that overt, but something in the vicinity of it. You do this, she said. Find what people want to be seen as. And use it. Use is a strong word, I said. I work with what's there. Is there a difference? She said. We were talking about rhetorical strategy. We were also talking about something else, specifically, I suspected, whether I'd been doing the same thing with her. It was a fair question. I'd been asking it myself. With the council, I said, I'm working with vanity. It's a lever, nothing more. I paused. With you I've been doing something different. What? She said. Saying what I actually think, I said. Which I don't do with everyone. The working room was quiet. The documentation was spread between us on the table, 4 years of her work and 2 hours of restructuring, and outside the 7th hour had come and gone without either of us noticing. "Why?" she said. Not challenging. Actually asking. I thought about it honestly, which meant thinking about it longer than was comfortable. "Because you asked real questions," I said. "And you listened to the answers. That's rarer than it should be." She looked at the documents. Then at me. Then back at the documents in the specific way of someone who has received something they're not ready to respond to directly. "The framing for the 3rd section," she said. "I want to revise it again." "Show me what you're thinking," I said. We went back to work. Neither of us mentioned what had just happened. But the quality of the room was different after it, in a way I couldn't have specified precisely but which I was aware of for the rest of the evening. I walked back to my quarters at the 9th hour thinking about real questions and what it means when someone asks them. I thought, I'm going to have to be careful. I thought, I'm probably already past the point where careful applies. The council session was in 12 days. We worked 6 of them. Not every evening. She had obligations that filled most of her time, and I had a cleaning schedule that was theoretically my primary function, though I noticed somewhere around day 40 that the people who monitored my cleaning had stopped monitoring it with the same attention. The watchers in the empty rooms had other things to watch. I filed this as information without deciding what to do with it. The working sessions had a rhythm by the 4th one. She would have reviewed whatever we'd done previously, identified 2 or 3 specific points she wanted to revisit, and arrived with those already formulated. I'd stopped bringing notes because she retained everything from the previous session and the conversations moved faster without me consulting paper. We disagreed approximately once per session on something substantive, and both times it resolved into a better version of the argument than either of us had started with, which is the correct outcome of a genuine disagreement as opposed to a performed one. I was aware that this was not what the contract had been purchased for. I was also aware that I didn't particularly care, which was itself information worth noting. On the 5th working session she arrived 20 minutes late, which hadn't happened before. She came in with the specific quality of someone who has been in a difficult room and is still carrying it. I didn't ask. I started where we'd left off the previous session. She stopped me after about 10 minutes. "The 4th house," she said. "On the council. They've indicated they'll oppose the reinstatement regardless of the argument." "Indicated how?" I said. "Through channels," she said. "Nothing formal. Nothing that can be addressed formally." I thought about that. "What's their specific interest in the current framework?" "The structural weakness," she said. "The single point of failure. For them it's not a weakness. It's leverage. If the framework has a vulnerability, and they're the ones who understand it best, that has value. They've been using it," I said. "For approximately 30 years," she said. "Yes." I sat with that for a moment. It reframed the entire council opposition, not ideology, not conservatism, just a specific interest in keeping a tool operational. Which meant the argument for reinstatement needed to either neutralize that interest or offer something better. "What do they actually want?" I said. "Not the leverage." "What's the leverage for?" She looked at me. "Why does that matter?" "Because if we know what they want, we can potentially give them a path to it that doesn't require keeping the weakness in place," I said. "The leverage is a means. What's the end?" "Influence over cross-house arbitration appointments," she said. "They want a formal role in selecting the senior arbiters for multi-house disputes." "That's a legitimate interest," I said. "It is," she said. "It's also something I've been unwilling to concede." "Why?" I said. She looked at me with the expression that meant she was deciding how directly to answer. "Because conceding it sets a precedent," she said. "They get the appointment influence, the next house wants something similar for a different function, and in 10 years the coalition governance structure has been quietly redistributed through a series of individually reasonable concessions. That's a real concern," I said. "And also possibly a reason the reinstatement hasn't moved in 4 years." "You think I should concede it?" she said. I think you should consider whether there's a version of it you can concede. I said. There's a difference between giving them appointment influence and giving them appointment influence within a defined scope that doesn't create the precedent you're worried about. She was quiet for a moment. A constrained version. A version that satisfies their actual interests without opening the structural door they'd use to expand it. I said. Which requires understanding their actual interests well enough to design the constraint correctly. And if I get it wrong, she said, if the constraint doesn't hold, then you're in a worse position than you are now. I said. It's a real risk. But you think it's worth taking. I think it's the only path that moves, I said. 4 years of the current approach has produced 4 years of results. At some point you have to consider that the obstacle isn't going away and the route needs to change. She stood and walked to the window. It was a habit I'd noticed. She moved when she was processing something she hadn't decided yet, like the physical motion helped the thinking. I'd started timing my silence to it, give her the full movement, let her come back when she was ready. She came back. If I pursue this, she said, I need someone who understands the fourth house's interests well enough to design the constraint correctly. My own advisors have relationships with all the houses that make them unsuitable for that analysis. Conflict of interest, I said. Yes. And you need someone without existing relationships, I said. And with relevant expertise, she said. We were talking about counsel strategy and political analysis. We were also talking about whether I was going to extend my involvement beyond what the cleaning contract required, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said it directly because saying it directly would require deciding something we were both apparently still approaching from the side. I'll need access to the fourth house's public arbitration record, I said. 30 years of it, ideally. Their patterns will be in there. I can have it provided, she said. Through the ancillary services clause, I said. Through whatever mechanism is available, she said. I looked at her. You've already checked whether there's a mechanism. A pause. The ancillary clause covers professional consultation when relevant expertise is available, she said. It's broad. Someone read that contract very carefully, I said. Someone wanted to understand what they purchased, she said. And then, with a precision that I recognized as deliberate. And what they hadn't. We were talking about contract language. We were talking about something considerably larger than contract language, and the specific quality of the room in that moment was the quality of two people who have been approaching something from the side for long enough that the side route and the direct route have converged. I'll start on the arbitration record tomorrow, I said. Good, she said. I'll need 2 weeks, I said. Minimum. Your contract has 4 weeks remaining, she said. I'm aware, I said. Neither of us addressed what happened after 4 weeks. The silence around it was its own kind of conversation. The council session is in 6 days, she said, returning to the documents. The argument is ready, I said. Has been since the 3rd session. The 4th house problem is separate. I know, she said. I wanted to keep working on it anyway. I looked at her. She was looking at the documents. So did I said. She didn't look up. But something changed in the set of her shoulders, a very small release of something that had been held. We went back to work. Outside, the palace continued its evening routines. Inside the working room, neither of us mentioned the 4 weeks. The council session went well. I know this because she told me, the evening after, in the working room, not the throne room version of telling, the private one, where the information comes without the framing around it. The 4th house abstained, she said. Not opposed, I said. Not opposed. The constrained appointment scope was acceptable to them. They'll want to formalize it in a separate agreement, but they didn't block the reinstatement. And the others? 6 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 opposed on principle who would have opposed anything I proposed regardless of merit. She paused. The reinstatement passes. 4 years, I said. For years, she said. And apparently what was needed was someone to tell me I was arguing correctly to the wrong question. The argument was always correct, I said. The room just needed a different door. She looked at me with something I'd been seeing more frequently over the past 2 weeks, not the evaluating expression, not the private working expression. Something that had replaced both of those and which I hadn't finished naming yet. The fourth house analysis, she said. How did you identify the appointment interest so precisely? 30 years of arbitration records, I said. The pattern was in there. They consistently intervened in multi-house disputes at the arbiter selection stage, not in the outcomes, just in who was selected to determine the outcomes. Once you see that pattern, the interest is obvious. My advisors have access to the same records, she said. Your advisors weren't looking for that pattern, I said. They were looking for opposition arguments. Different search, different result. You looked for what they wanted, she said, not what they were against. It's the more useful question, I said. Opposition is usually instrumental. What people want is structural. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you do that with everyone? Look for what they want rather than what they're against. Professionally, I said. Yes. And personally? I thought about that. Less systematically, I said. But yes, probably. What do you think I want? She said. We were talking about analytical methodology. We were not talking about analytical methodology. I looked at her across the working table with its 4 years of documents, and 2 months of evening sessions, and the specific quality of a room that has been used for real work and has the accumulated weight of it. I think you want the coalition to work the way it was designed to work, I said. Not because you need it to, you have enough personal authority to operate around its failures, but because you understand that something built correctly is more durable than something propped up by individual will. And you find the propping exhausting. She was very still. I think you want someone to argue back, I said. Not to challenge your authority, to engage with the actual problem. Your advisors agree with you. That's not useful when you're wrong, and occasionally you're wrong. Occasionally, she said. The third section of the counsel argument, I said. First version. You were wrong about the precedent risk, and it took 40 minutes of me being annoying for you to see it. You were annoying, she said. Yes, I said. And you listened anyway. Which is rarer than it should be. She stood and walked to the window. I waited. She came back. The contract ends in 2 weeks, she said. Yes, I said. I'm not going to ask you to stay, she said. I want to be clear about that. All right, I said. What I'm going to do, she said, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this, is tell you that there are approximately 14 ongoing arbitration questions in the coalition that my current advisors are not equipped to handle well, and that the ancillary services clause as currently written would not cover continued engagement after the primary contract ends, and that rewriting it into a formal consultancy agreement would take approximately 1 week to draft correctly. 1 week, I said. Which is the last week of the current contract. Yes, she said. So if I agreed to the consultancy in principle today, I said, the drafting would begin immediately, and the new agreement would be ready to sign at the point when the current one expires. With no gap in engagement, she said. Yes. That's very efficiently structured, I said. I've had time to think about it, she said. We were talking about contract mechanics. We were talking about the next thing, whatever it was, and neither of us was naming it directly because naming it directly would require deciding what it was, and some things are better approached from the side until they aren't anymore. What are the 14 questions? I said. She told me. They were good questions, genuinely complex, the kind that required the specific combination of historical framework knowledge and current political mapping that I'd been building for 2 months. I asked 3 clarifying questions. She answered them with the precision I'd come to expect. The fourth house agreement, I said. The formalization. That'll need to happen in the first month or the window closes. I know, she said. It's the first of the 14. Second, I said. The first is the precedent containment language. If that's not airtight before the fourth house agreement is finalized, the constraint doesn't hold. She looked at me. You've already been thinking about the sequence. I've been thinking about the 14 questions since you mentioned them, I said. I started sequencing them on the walk here. The walk from your quarters, she said. 10 minutes. I think quickly when something's interesting, I said. Something moved across her face, fully this time, not contained. Not the professional expression or the private working expression. Something underneath both of those that I'd been seeing glimpses of for 2 months and was finally seeing directly. The consultancy agreement, she said. The scope would need to be defined carefully. Yes, I said. Broad enough to cover the range of questions, she said. Narrow enough that it's a professional arrangement and not. She stopped. Not what? I said. She looked at me directly. Not something that requires a different kind of conversation. We were talking about contract scope. We were standing at the edge of the thing we'd been approaching from the side for 2 months, and we were both aware of it, and neither of us had moved yet. The consultancy agreement, I said carefully, can be drafted to cover professional engagement. Whatever else might need a different kind of conversation, that's separate from the agreement. Separate, she said. Separate, I said. And not time-sensitive in the same way. She held my gaze for a moment that was longer than professional context required. Draft the precedent containment language first, she said. Before anything else. I'll have something by tomorrow evening, I said. Good, she said. I gathered the documents I'd been working from and left. In the corridor, I thought about the specific quality of the pause before she'd said draft the precedent containment language first, the weight in it, the thing it was standing in for. I thought, the separate conversation is coming. I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to be the one who starts it. I thought, that's probably fine. The contract ended on a Tuesday. I know this because I wrote it in my notes. * primary contract concluded. Consultancy agreement signed. Effective immediately. * clean and factual, the way I write things I want to remember accurately rather than romantically. The signing happened in the working room, which felt correct. No ceremony, no court, just the two of us in Paris, her administrative aide, who witnessed the signatures and left with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting this for some time. After he left, we sat with the signed documents between us, and neither of us spoke for a moment. The precedent containment language, she said finally. Fourth house meeting is next week. I'll be ready, I said. I know, she said. Another silence. The working room had the quality it always had at the end of an evening session, accumulated weight, the specific atmosphere of a space where real work had happened. The original contract, I said. The one you purchased. You said the purpose was to humiliate me? Yes, she said. You paid considerably more than the arbitration market rate for my services, I said. I looked it up. The auction price was approximately 3 times what a direct consultancy engagement would have cost. She looked at me. Yes. So you overpaid significantly to acquire something you then used incorrectly, I said. By any professional standard, that's a poor transaction. Yes, she said. It was. The lease renewal I was going to fund with the contract money, I said. I hadn't booked it yet. I was waiting until I returned. She looked at me steadily. I'm not going back, I said. To renew it. The working room was very quiet. Outside, the palace continued its night routines. The consultancy agreement sat between us on the table, signed and effective and covering 14 questions that would probably become more before they became fewer. Why are you smiling? She said. For the first time in 11 years, I had an answer that wasn't professional. And that's the end, for now. If you want to see my stories more often, hit subscribe and you won't miss a thing. And if you're not ready to stop yet, another story is already waiting for you on screen.